The telephone on the kitchen wall of a house in Missouri in 1960 is the color of an avocado, pale and slightly waxy under the overhead light. Its handset rests in the cradle at a small angle, the way it always lands when someone has hung up quickly, the coiled cord hanging without movement against the painted plaster. The kitchen is quiet. The rest of the house is quiet above it. Somewhere on the second floor, behind a closed door, two children are asleep in their beds, and the girl who is watching them has been sitting on the living room sofa for the past 2 hours, listening to the particular quality of silence that belongs to someone else's house at night. The sofa has a plaid pattern. The television is on, but turned low. Through the window, the street outside is still, the broad, flat, carefully arranged street of a post-war subdivision, its lawns separated by identical driveways, its houses dark at the upper windows. The girl is perhaps 16. She has been left with a phone number written on a notepad beside the refrigerator, the parents' handwriting in blue ink, and the understanding that she is responsible for whatever the night brings. The telephone is the only line between her and anyone else she knows. It sits there on the wall, pale and warm from an earlier call, and it does not ring. This is the opening image that belongs to one of the most geographically widespread and emotionally durable stories in American oral tradition. It did not begin in a film, though it would eventually find its way into several. It did not begin in a newspaper, though real events would eventually give researchers pause. It began the way the most lasting stories almost always begin, in one voice, passing something to another voice, in a room where the lights were out, and the hour was late, and the people listening were exactly the right age to carry it forward. Folklore collectors first began documenting written versions of the Babysitter legend in or around 1960. The earliest recorded instances circulated primarily among teenage girls in Missouri and Illinois, passed between them in the way that mattered most before the internet and before television made everything simultaneous, which is to say in person, at close range, in the particular hush that falls over a group of young people when one of them starts a story that the others can already feel is going somewhere unsettling. The story was not invented so much as it was recognized. It arrived among its first recorded audiences the way certain stories do, carrying the sensation of something that was already almost known. What the collectors found, when they began writing it down, was not a fixed narrative, but a cluster of stable elements arranged around a single dreadful pivot. A girl, alone in a house that is not her own, children asleep somewhere above her or below her, a telephone, a call, a voice she does not recognize, saying something wrong, and then the discovery, which varies in its specifics, but never in its structure, that the voice was not calling from outside the house at all. The folklore researcher Jan Harold Brunvand cataloged this story in his 1981 book Asterisk, The Vanishing Hitchhiker, Asterisk, which gathered the most carefully documented American urban legends of the mid-20th century and examined them with the attention usually reserved for older, more formally recognized narrative traditions. Brunvand had spent years collecting what folklorists call contemporary legends, stories that circulate in the present tense, stories that someone's cousin or neighbor or coworker claims either witnessed or experienced. And among the hundreds he assembled, the Babysitter story stood out for two qualities he noted explicitly. The first was its geographic range. By the time Brunvand was writing, variants had been collected from states as far apart as coastal Maine and the Texas Panhandle, from Appalachia in the Pacific Northwest, from densely populated suburbs, and from small agricultural towns where the houses sat acres apart. The second quality was its stability. Across all those variants, collected across decades and hundreds of miles, the emotional architecture of the story remained essentially unchanged. The specific details shifted, the underlying shape did not. That shape is worth understanding because it is not the shape of most horror stories. Most horror stories move outward. They take their protagonist from safety into danger, from the known into the unknown. The babysitter legend moves inward. The threat does not enter from outside. The threat is already inside. It has been there apparently for some portion of the evening, sharing the same air and the same walls and the same carefully arranged silence. And the story's horror is not in the arrival of something dangerous, but in the discovery that the familiar space was never quite as safe as it felt. That is a different kind of story, and it works on a different part of the mind. The American suburbs provided exactly the physical environment the story needed to feel plausible. The post-war expansion of housing in the United States produced a specific type of domestic architecture, the split level, the colonial, the ranch house with its added second floor, characterized by rooms that were acoustically separated from each other in ways that older housing had not been. A child asleep in an upstairs bedroom in a 1958 Illinois subdivision was genuinely isolated from the kitchen on the ground floor. Sound did not carry through carpeted hallways and closed doors the way it carried through the thin walls and shared staircases of pre-war apartment buildings, or older farmhouses where rooms opened directly into one another. The suburban house was designed for privacy between its occupants, and privacy, it turns out, is not a neutral quality when you are examining whether a story's central premise is structurally believable to its audience. A girl sitting in a split-level living room in 1960 could not see the staircase from the sofa. She could not see the hallway from the kitchen. She could not hear what was happening on the second floor without climbing the stairs to check, and she was unlikely to climb the stairs without a reason. The house was a collection of separated spaces, connected by passages that could be traversed quietly. Anyone who had grown up in such a house or spent a night in one already understood this without being told. The story did not need to explain the architecture. The architecture was the audience's own. This is part of what Brunvand meant when he described the legend as emotionally durable. It did not ask its listeners to imagine a place they had never been. It asked them to reimagine a place they already knew, and that act of reimagining, taking the familiar and finding something wrong inside it, is one of the more quietly effective operations a story can perform. Regional variants of the legend began diverging in ways that revealed something about the anxieties of particular places and communities. In the Midwestern versions that Brunvand's collection drew from most heavily, the intruder was typically placed in the basement, that specifically Midwestern domestic space, the room below the ground, the room with one set of stairs leading down into it, and no windows looking onto the street. The basement, in Midwestern domestic life, occupied an ambiguous position. It was storage and utility, and in many houses, recreation. The finished basement, with its paneled walls and second-hand furniture, was a standard feature of a certain era of suburban construction. But it was also below. It was the part of the house that was underground, and the legend knew exactly what to do with that. Appalachian variants took a different approach. In some of these versions, the threatening calls were replaced by sounds, scratching at a surface, breathing that came through the receiver in odd intervals, whispered words that might have been words or might have been something the connection was doing. The caller in these versions did not speak clearly. The ambiguity was part of the terror. A bad phone connection in a rural area was a known and ordinary experience, and the genius of these variants was to place something genuinely wrong inside a familiar category of nuisance. The listener couldn't be sure what they were hearing. That uncertainty, it turned out, worked as well as any explicit threat. The scholars Linda Day and Alan Dundas, writing in the tradition of formal folklore classification, positioned the babysitter legend within a cluster of what they called female-centered cautionary narratives, stories that circulated primarily among young women and that addressed, in the vocabulary of the genre, the specific vulnerabilities of domestic isolation. The cluster also included the hook-handed killer at the lover's lane, the poisoned dress, the vanishing hitchhiker whose car arrives home before she does. What these stories shared, Deshingan Dundas argued, was a structural attention to the gap between what a young woman was told about safety and what the world was actually prepared to guarantee. They were not ghost stories. They were not supernatural stories. The horror in all of them was grounded entirely in realistic threat, which is a particular kind of horror, not the horror of the impossible, but the horror of the very possible, dressed in familiar clothes. The babysitter legend was notable within this cluster for the specific nature of its realistic threat. It did not require a killer in the dark outside. It did not require bad luck on an empty road. It required only a house, a phone, and the assumption that the inside of the house was safe, and then it quietly removed that assumption while the girl on the sofa was watching someone else's television. Degan Dundas also noted something that later researchers would return to repeatedly: the story's near-total absence of supernatural content. Other legends in the female-centered cautionary cluster occasionally drifted toward the ghostly or the uncanny. The babysitter legend, in its documented forms, almost never did. The intruder was always human. The threat was always of a kind that could appear in a police report. This grounding in the possible, they argued, was not an absence of craft, but a feature of it. The story worked precisely because it refused to give its audience the distance of the impossible. In the autumn of 1963, a folklore collection document was produced as part of a university study, the paper slightly yellowed now in whatever archive it has reached. The typeface, a little uneven in the way of documents produced on machines that had been used long enough to develop minor mechanical habits. On one page, among the collected variants organized by region and approximate date of first circulation, a researcher had underlined 2 words with a pencil. The words were caller traced. They appeared in a summary of the legend's climactic discovery, the moment when the telephone operator, or the police, or whoever carried the weight of the institutional world in that particular variant, informed the girl that the calls were coming from inside the house. Someone had found those 2 words important enough to underline, and had underlined them twice, as though once was not quite enough. The act of underlining suggests a particular kind of attention. The researcher was not noting whether the story was true. They were noting that the story contained, at its pivot, an act of institutional verification, a trace, a location, a confirmation by external authority of what the girl had begun to suspect. The legend's horror was not released into ambiguity at the end. It was confirmed. The telephone could be traced. The truth of the danger could be established. And what the trace established was that the girl had been wrong about where she was, wrong about which side of the walls the threat existed on, wrong about what the interior of the house contained. Typed case files and pencil-marked field notes gathered at a university reading table in the early 1980s represented, by the time Bronvond was working, a genuinely substantial archive. Bronvond had spent years soliciting variant texts from colleagues, from students, from the kind of reader who recognizes a story they've heard and sends in their own version of it. The variants that came back from Arkansas and Ohio and coastal Maine were arranged on a reading table in a long row, index cards organized geographically, annotated by date, marked with the specific elements that distinguished each version from the others. Some had the caller speaking obscenities, some had him breathing, some had him describing what he could see from where he was standing, some had him saying nothing at all, just holding the line open with a silence that felt occupied. What the row of index cards showed, laid out in that order, was not chaos but pattern. The variants were not random mutations, they were something more orderly, a story that had been tested in the specific laboratory of oral transmission against hundreds of different listeners in dozens of different places, and that had discovered through that testing which elements were load-bearing and which could be changed without the whole thing falling apart. The telephone was load-bearing, the isolation was load-bearing, the children asleep upstairs were load-bearing. The specific nature of the voice, it turned out, was not. It could be threatening, or silent, or whispered, or absent entirely, and the story still worked. The discovery at the end was load-bearing. Everything between the first call and the final knowledge could be arranged in several different ways. The arrival at that knowledge could not. This kind of structural consistency is what distinguishes a legend, in the formal folklore sense, from mere rumor or casual story. Rumors change in all directions at once, accumulating and losing detail without stable logic. Legends travel with their bones intact. The specific muscle and skin can change with each retelling, adapting to the local climate, adjusting for the particular audience, taking on details that make it feel immediately and personally relevant. But the skeleton is preserved. Whatever the story is really about is protected by the telling, carried forward through every variant, without being lost or softened or transformed into something different. What the Babysitter legend was really about, what its skeleton said beneath all the regional muscle, was the unreliability of a specific and deeply held assumption, the assumption that the inside of the house is the safe side, the assumption that the phone call is a connection to safety rather than a line through which danger can speak, the assumption that the familiar layout of rooms and hallways and closed doors means that the space is known, and knowing a space means nothing dangerous is sharing it with you. The legend dismantled each of these assumptions in sequence, and it did so by using the most ordinary tools: a telephone, a house, an evening, a girl who was simply doing her job. The stories spread through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, can be partially tracked through the folklore record, though the oral record is by nature incomplete. Most versions were never written down. Most tellings left no trace beyond the memory of whoever heard them. What the record does show is the legend operating across a remarkably wide social range. It was not confined to any single demographic or geographic community. Urban versions existed alongside rural ones. Versions from affluent suburbs sat beside versions from modest small-town neighborhoods. The emotional premise was apparently portable. It needed only a house, a telephone, and the basic structure of an evening when someone younger and less experienced was in charge. There is something in that portability worth dwelling on for a moment. The most durable stories are rarely the most extreme ones. The most durable stories are usually the ones that ask their audiences to imagine a slight displacement of something already familiar, a small wrongness in a known context, because that is the kind of imagining that an audience can perform effortlessly without being guided through it. The Babysitter legend asked nothing extravagant of its audience. It asked them to take the house they already knew, the phone they had already used, the responsibility they had already felt, and shift one variable. The variable it shifted was, what if the inside of the house is not only yours, A slumber party in the early 1960s, somewhere in the flat suburban territory of the American Midwest, would have been a familiar occasion for the legend's transmission. Four girls in sleeping bags on a carpeted floor, the overhead light switched off, the windows showing the quiet geometry of the subdivision outside, the street lamp, the driveway, the dark upstairs windows of the neighboring house. Someone starts talking, the others go still. The story being told is one that none of them has heard in exactly this form, but all of them feel they recognize something in it, the way you recognize a road you have driven before, even when you are approaching it from an unfamiliar direction. The voice telling the story is careful about the details it chooses: the plaid sofa, the avocado telephone, the pale handset, warm from a call made earlier in the evening. The details are not ornamental. They are the evidence the story offers that it is real, or could be, or nearly was. Someone's cousin, someone's neighbor, someone who babysat for the Hendersons or the Malones, or whoever the local name happened to be. The story arrives claiming a source, a real girl, a real house, a real telephone on a real kitchen wall, and the claim to reality is part of what it asks its audience to carry forward. Each girl in that room will tell the story again. She will tell it at a different slumber party, or to a friend walking home from school, or to a younger sister who has just started babysitting and who the teller feels, obscurely, should know this. She will change some details without realizing it. She will keep others with a fidelity she couldn't fully explain, because those are the ones that felt true, the ones the story couldn't work without. The telephone will stay avocado or turn white, depending on what seems right in the retelling. The children upstairs will stay asleep in both versions. The discovery at the end will remain. The legend will pass from one teenage voice to another across a decade that saw the American suburb consolidate into the dominant form of domestic life that most of the country's population now inhabited. It will travel through a landscape of split-level houses and carpeted hallways and kitchen telephones hung on painted plaster walls, finding its audience among the people who recognize those walls from their own daily experience, who knew the acoustic isolation of a house built for privacy, who had sat on a plaid sofa in someone else's living room at night with a phone number written on a notepad and the children asleep upstairs and the long quiet of the evening arranged around them. It will find its audience because it is not a story about something foreign. It is a story about a feeling that its audience already had in some small and unexpressed form. The feeling of being responsible for something that could not quite be fully seen in a space that could not quite be fully known, connected to the rest of the world by a single pale telephone on a kitchen wall. By the time Brunvand was collecting variants in the late 1970s, the legend had been traveling for close to 20 years. It had covered the country and found its way into every region with enough variation to feel local and enough consistency to be recognizable. The girl was always alone in a way that mattered. The house was always one that had interiors she couldn't see from where she was sitting. The phone was always the one object that connected her to whoever might help, and it was always the same object through which the wrong thing first spoke. The researchers who classified the legend were interested in what it preserved. They noted the absence of the supernatural, the grounding in realistic threat, the specific focus on domestic space and domestic isolation, the way it circulated primarily among the young women who were most likely to occupy exactly the position the story described. They noted the emotional logic, the way the legend's horror was proportional and specific, not the generalized dread of a ghost story, but the particular dread of a situation that could be drawn on a map with walls and a staircase, and a room above and a room below. What they were perhaps less focused on, because it was not the kind of thing that fit neatly onto an index card, was the relationship between the story and the people who kept choosing to tell it. The legend was a warning, in the sense that cautionary stories are warnings, but it was also something else. It was a form of shared attention, a way of acknowledging in the register of the narrative, rather than the register of the straightforward statement, that the situation it described was a real situation that real girls found themselves in, that the feeling of being alone in a house that was not quite fully known was a feeling that deserved to be taken seriously. The story took it seriously. That is part of what made it last. The index cards are presumably still in an archive somewhere, organized by region and date, the pencil annotations still legible under whatever light the room provides. The paper of the 1963 field collection is a little more yellowed now than it was when the researcher underlined those two words, caller traced, for the second time, pressing the pencil slightly harder on the second pass, the way someone does when they want to make sure the mark will hold. The mark held. The story held. The telephone on the kitchen wall in Missouri in 1960 has long since been replaced by a different phone, then a cordless phone, then something that fits in a pocket and contains more computing power than the entire block possessed in that year. The plaid sofa has been reupholstered or retired. The subdivision has aged into a neighborhood with large trees over the streets, and the particular worn-in quality of a place that has been lived in by 2 or 3 generations of families. But the legend traveled past all of that. It found the girls who needed to hear it in each decade, as the decades turned, adjusting its surface details with each generation while keeping its bones exactly as they were. The house, the phone, the isolation, the knowledge that arrives too late, or just in time. It passed from voice to voice the way the most durable things pass, without requiring formal transmission or institutional preservation, needing only a room where the lights were out, and someone who had heard it leaned toward someone who hadn't. The lights went out. One of the girls in the sleeping bag on the carpet shifted to get comfortable. Outside, the suburban street held its particular silence, wide and flat and well lit, nothing moving, every house dark above the ground floor. Someone started talking in the dark, choosing the details carefully, keeping the ones that felt true. The others went still to listen. The window showed only the street lamp and the quiet geometry of the driveways and the dark rectangle of the neighboring house's upstairs window. And somewhere in the room, without announcement, a story that had already crossed 2/3 of the country found 4 more people to carry it forward into the next morning, and the next telling, and the long way ahead. In a private house in the early 1920s, a telephone ringing at night was an event of some consequence. The instrument had been in the home perhaps 2 or 3 years. It lived on a small table in the hallway, or on a shelf near the kitchen door, and on ordinary evenings it was simply furniture, a dark, upright object with no more claim on the household than the coat rack beside it. But at night, when the gas lamps had been turned low and the house had settled into its particular silence, the bell carried differently. It traveled through walls. It woke people from the first loose layers of sleep, and a person walking to answer it, bare feet on a wood floor, one hand steadying along the hallway wall, a single bulb switched on overhead, had no way to know before lifting the receiver who was on the other side of it. That was new. A knock at the door came with a silhouette, a shape, a direction. The telephone brought a voice into the house before anything else. About the caller had been established, and in the dark of a winter hallway, that asymmetry had a particular quality to it. The voice arrived. Everything else about its owner remained somewhere else. The telephone became a fixture of American private life with remarkable speed. By 1920, roughly 13 million telephone sets were installed in homes and businesses across the United States, a number that would more than double over the following decade as rural electrification extended the network outward from cities into smaller towns and farming communities. The device was sold consistently and warmly as a convenience, a means of reaching a doctor quickly, of coordinating with a neighbor, of maintaining connection across the distances that American geography had always imposed. The advertising of the period showed mothers, daughters, well-appointed living rooms. The telephone in these images was always a tool for closeness. What the advertisements did not mention, and perhaps had no reason yet to consider, was that the same wire that brought a familiar voice in could also bring an unfamiliar one, and that there was no mechanism at all for distinguishing between them before the call was answered. Reports of threatening and obscene telephone calls began appearing in American newspaper accounts almost as early as the telephone appeared in private homes. The 1910s produced scattered accounts in city papers, Chicago, Cincinnati, Philadelphia, of women who had received calls from anonymous men. The calls described in the clipped euphemisms of the period, but clearly falling into categories that would today be recognized immediately. The 1920s brought more of them. The pattern was consistent enough across these accounts that switchboard operators, almost universally women, in that period had developed informal protocols for handling complaints about repeat anonymous callers, noting the timing of calls, attempting to trace them through the physical limitations of the switchboard technology then available. A 1920s operator seated at her board in a wooden booth, her headset pressed to one ear, taking down a complaint about a man who had been ringing the same number for 3 consecutive nights, was participating in a problem that had no legal framework yet and no clear institutional response. She was working at the edge of something the law had not yet caught up to. The legal architecture around telephone harassment developed slowly and unevenly across the first half of the 20th century. Individual states moved at different speeds and in different directions. Some addressed it through existing statutes on disturbing the peace or harassment, stretching language written for a world without telephone lines to fit the new circumstances. Others made no provision at all. The patchwork meant that a person receiving threatening calls in one state might have legal recourse while a person in the neighboring state had none, and even where law existed on paper, enforcement was difficult in practice. Tracing a call required cooperation from the telephone company, and the telephone company's cooperation required either its own internal policy or a court order, and the court order required a judge willing to treat the matter as serious. A chain of contingencies that often failed at one link or another, leaving the recipient of threatening calls with the knowledge that someone had access to their voice and their time and their nervous system, and no effective mechanism for stopping them. The federal government did not address interstate telephone harassment directly until 1968, when Congress passed an amendment to the Communications Act that made it a federal offense to use a telephone in interstate commerce to make obscene or threatening calls. The amendment arrived after years of testimony and documented cases, and the congressional record from that period includes a stack of printed case files, opened at hearings to pages describing anonymous threatening calls received by isolated women at home, a detail that sits quietly in the historical record, neither dramatic nor small, simply noting that by 1968 the accumulation of cases had grown sufficient to bring the matter before the federal legislature. The law that emerged was a beginning rather than a resolution. It addressed interstate calls, which were a subset of the problem. Intrastate harassment remained a state matter. The underlying asymmetry, one person knowing where another was, while the other person knew nothing, remained precisely as it had been. What the law was slow to address, storytelling grasped intuitively. Horror in American popular culture had, through the first half of the 20th century, organized itself around a fairly stable set of threatening figures: the figure at the window, the shape in the doorway, the footstep on the stair. These images worked because they placed the threat at the boundary of the domestic space, approaching, perhaps about to enter, but still on the other side of a threshold that the occupant controlled. The door could be locked, the window could be shuttered. The structure of the threat had a spatial logic that matched the spatial logic of the home. Outside was dangerous, inside was safe, and the horror was the possibility of crossing from one to the other. The telephone changed that geometry. When a threat arrived by telephone, it was already inside. The voice came through the wire and into the room where the person was standing, bypassing every lock and every threshold, and arrived with a quality of intimacy, close to the ear, quiet, present, that no figure at a window could match. Horror storytellers in the late 1940s and 1950s began to register this distinction, and the telephone started appearing in American horror with increasing frequency, not as set dressing, but as the primary instrument of threat. Radio drama, which was then still at the height of its cultural reach, proved a particularly natural medium for this. The voice alone, without a face, without a body, placed directly in the listener's ear by the headset or the speaker, was already a form of telephone logic, and sound engineers at the major networks developed specific techniques for rendering the telephone voice within a broadcast drama in ways that heightened its menacing quality. A 1949 broadcast booth in New York or Chicago, a sound engineer holding a receiver close to a microphone while an actor spoke a threatening line into it. The reverb adjusted by small increments, the acoustic quality of the voice tuned to sound intimate and sourceless at once. This was craft in service of an insight the technology had provided, that a voice without a body occupied a different category of threat than a body with one. The insight had a precise emotional mechanism behind it, though the language for that mechanism would come later. What the sound engineers were working with by instinct was the problem of the invisible. A visible threat is a threat that can be assessed. Distance, size, direction, intention, these are all things a visible threat communicates, even when what it communicates is alarming. An invisible threat communicates only its own existence. The person receiving a threatening call knows that something is wrong and knows that they do not know enough to evaluate how wrong, or how close, or what to do. The information gap itself becomes the most frightening element, because the mind encountering a gap in a threatening situation tends to fill it with the worst available possibility. The absence of information in a threatening call is not neutral. It is a space the imagination enters, and what the imagination produces in that space is rarely reassuring. FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit case reviews from later decades would document this mechanism from the other direction, from the perspective of those who made threatening calls, and what those calls were designed to accomplish. A pattern emerged from the reviewed cases in which telephone calls were used not as the primary event of a threatening situation, but as a preparatory or monitoring tool. Calls were made to confirm that someone was home, to determine whether they were alone, to observe changes in their level of alertness or distress over a series of contacts. The telephone in these cases functioned as a form of surveillance that required no proximity and left no physical trace. The caller could be anywhere. The recipient had no way of knowing whether the person on the line was 10 miles away or across the street, and that uncertainty was, in many of the documented cases, precisely the point. The calls were not the act. They were the space created before the act, and part of what they created was a condition in the recipient that made certain responses more likely and certain protections harder to maintain. The recipient of a threatening or anonymous call is placed in an unusual cognitive position. The normal cues that people use to assess social threat, physical presence, facial expression, body language, distance, are absent. What remains is the voice, which is among the oldest and most finely calibrated instruments of threat detection the human nervous system has. A voice carries information about emotional state, intent, physical size, and proximity through acoustic features that people process without conscious effort, having done so for the whole of human evolutionary history. But a voice on a telephone is a voice that has already been separated from its body, placed into an electrical signal, transmitted across a distance, and reconstituted through a speaker, and this process preserves some features and alters others in ways that were not, from an evolutionary standpoint, something the human nervous system had any prior experience with. The voice on a telephone sounds like a person nearby. The nervous system responds to it partly as though a person were nearby, but the person is not nearby, or might not be, and the simultaneous presence and absence of the voice creates a kind of perceptual uncertainty that the nervous system has no clean protocol for resolving. Research published in the Journal of Traumatic Stress examined this uncertainty in recipients of sustained threatening telephone calls and found a coherent pattern of effects that extended well beyond the period during which the calls were being received. Recipients developed elevated cortisol levels, the hormone associated with sustained stress activation, and the elevation persisted not only during periods of active contact, but between calls and after calls ceased, often for weeks or months. Hypervigilance, which is the state of sustained environmental monitoring in which ordinary sensory input is continuously assessed for threat relevance, was documented in nearly all recipients studied. Sleep disruption was also consistent across the research population, appearing both as difficulty initiating sleep and as early waking, a pattern common in sustained threat conditions, in which the nervous system maintains a partial vigilance through the night that is not fully compatible with the restorative depth of normal sleep. These effects were not produced by any physical harm. In the cases studied, the calls had remained calls. Nothing had crossed any threshold. The damage was produced entirely by the information structure of the situation, the knowledge that someone was watching or might be, the inability to locate them, the understanding that the calls could resume at any moment. That specific cluster of effects, elevated arousal, disrupted sleep, sustained hypervigilance in the absence of any physical event, appears in the clinical literature as a fairly reliable consequence of situations in which threat is ongoing, but unlocatable, and it connects to something older than the telephone by a very large margin. The experience of not knowing where a threat is, or whether it is close, is one that the human nervous system responds to with a particular quality of sustained activation that is different from the acute response to a visible threat. Acute threat produces a fast, high-intensity response that tends to discharge through action. Sustained unlocatable threat produces a lower chronic activation that cannot discharge because there is no direction in which to act. The telephone call, especially the threatening or anonymous call, is very well suited to producing the second kind. The voice is present, the person is absent, the line is open, the moment extends. All of this, it is worth observing, was understood by the craftspeople making horror radio dramas in 1949 and horror films in the 1950s and 1960s, long before the clinical research caught up to it. They understood it not through experimental data, but through audience response, through the specific quality of silence that fell over a room full of listeners or a theater full of viewers when the telephone rang in an empty house, or when a voice on the line said something that established, with absolute clarity, that it knew where the person receiving the call was standing. The response was not to a monster, which the period also offered in considerable abundance. It was to a voice and its implications, a voice without a body, a presence without a location. The radio drama form exploited this in ways that later visual media would take decades to match. A voice spoken into a microphone and transmitted to a speaker in a listener's living room already had the telephone's logic. It was intimate, it was directional, coming from that specific point in the room, and it was sourceless because the person speaking was not there. When a radio drama placed a threatening voice on the telephone within its narrative, it doubled this effect. The listener heard a voice on the radio telling the story of a character who was hearing a voice on the telephone, and both transmissions had the same structural quality. A presence that had arrived without a body, that spoke without being seeable, that knew where the recipient was, even though the recipient did not know where it was. The doubling was probably not calculated. Radio writers were working quickly and pragmatically, filling broadcast hours, but its effect was real. The threatening telephone call in a radio drama worked especially well on radio because the medium and the device shared the same architecture. The transition from radio drama to broadcast television, which occurred rapidly across the early 1950s as sets became affordable household items, introduced the complication of visual confirmation. Television could show the caller or show where the call was coming from, and the moment it did, the asymmetry collapsed. Part of what the threatening call worked on was the invisibility of its origin, and a camera pointing at the origin removed that invisibility entirely. Television horror of the period showed an interesting negotiation with this limitation. Threatening calls appeared in stories, but writers and directors learned quickly to hold the camera away from the caller's location, to keep the origin unrevealed, to use the limitation of the visual frame to reproduce the same information gap that was built into the telephone by design. The techniques were different. The underlying logic was the same: withhold the location. Let the voice remain sourceless. Let the space between what is known and what is not do the work that explicit threat would do less well. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, when the babysitter legend was taking its most stable shape in the oral tradition of American teenage girls, the cultural groundwork for its telephone mechanics had been thoroughly laid. The threatening call was not a fresh idea. It was a device with an established grammar, recognizable conventions, and an emotional logic that had already been tested across 3 decades of telephone crimes, newspaper accounts, legal debates, and dramatic productions. A teenage girl hearing the story at a slumber party already had a framework, probably without knowing she had it, for understanding exactly why the calls were frightening in the specific way they were frightening. She had grown up in houses with telephones. She had perhaps heard about threatening calls, or had parents who discussed the problem in the abstract, or had encountered the device in a radio drama she half heard from another room. She did not need the legend to explain to her that a telephone call was frightening. She needed only the specific scenario in which the call arrived when she was alone in an unfamiliar house, responsible for children who were sleeping somewhere above her, and the location of the caller was uncertain. The legend's version of the threatening call was distinctive in one precise and important way. It used the tracing of the call not as a resolution, but as a reversal. In most threatening call narratives up to that point, the tracing of the call's origin was the moment of protection. Police could now locate the caller, the threat could be addressed, the asymmetry of information could be corrected. The babysitter legend kept the structure intact, but rotated it. The call was traced, the location was established, and what the location established was not safety, but the opposite, because the caller was not distant at all. The information that was supposed to protect had instead produced a more complete picture of the danger. The trace didn't close the gap. It revealed how small the gap had always been. This was, from a storytelling standpoint, a genuinely elegant reversal, taking the one instrument of safety embedded in the threatening call scenario and using it to deepen the threat rather than resolve it. It was also, from a psychological standpoint, a precise rendering of one of the more troubling features of unlocatable threat: the possibility that the effort to locate it might produce information that is worse than the uncertainty it replaces. Not knowing where a threat is carries a particular kind of distress. Knowing that it is closer than imagined carries a different one. The legend's mechanics placed its recipient exactly at the moment of that transition, the moment when uncertainty resolved into proximity. The telephone as cultural object was, by the early 1960s, inextricably bound up with the specific quality of domestic isolation the legend required. A suburban house in 1960 was not a well-connected place in the way that contemporary life might understand connection. A teenager babysitting on a Saturday night in an Illinois split level had a telephone, one telephone, mounted to the kitchen wall with a cord long enough to reach the kitchen table but not the living room, and had perhaps a neighbor's number written on a notepad beside it, and had beyond that the abstract awareness that the police could be reached, and had nothing else. The telephone was the single instrument of connection the house offered. It was the means of calling for help, and it was also the means by which the threatening voice had arrived. The same object that represented rescue was the object through which the danger had spoken. That doubling, the telephone as both lifeline and threat vector, was not incidental to the legend's emotional architecture. It was the legend's core. A story in which the threat came through the window would have a different grammar. The window can be locked, the drapes drawn, the distance maintained. But a threat that comes through the same wire as help, that uses the same instrument as rescue, places the recipient in a position in which the very act of reaching for protection engages the same channel the threat has already claimed. There is no clean separation. Every call received, after the threatening calls begin, arrives with the uncertainty of the first ring intact, and the question of who is on the other side of it cannot be resolved until the receiver is lifted and the voice is heard. American horror discovered this asymmetry and held onto it. Radio drama used it. Broadcast television worked around the visual complications it created and found ways to preserve it. And the oral tradition carried it, undecorated, from one generation of teenage girls to the next, in suburban living rooms and at slumber parties, and in the quiet spaces of an adolescence spent in houses that were large and well-furnished, and only apparently safe. The legend did not need to explain why a call was frightening. It assumed the listener already knew. What it offered instead was the precise scenario in which that existing knowledge would become something more personal, not the general fact of anonymous calling, but the particular image of a girl in a kitchen, alone, the phone in her hand, the house quiet above her, the operator's voice telling her something she had not expected to hear. There is a persistence to the device, a staying power that exceeds the specific technology of the telephone exchange and the rotary dial and the operator who answered when the receiver was lifted. Later versions of the story updated the equipment. Caller ID appeared and had to be circumvented. Mobile phones appeared and were explained away. The internet connected homes in ways that the single wall-mounted telephone had not, providing more channels of contact and more avenues for help.
Each new version of the story renegotiated the logic of the isolated caretaker and the untraceable threat, adjusting the mechanics so that the isolation was preserved despite the thickening web of communication the new technology offered. The threat adapted. The legend adapted with it. The
telephone remained at the center, not because the specific instrument was irreplaceable, but because the relationship it embodied, a voice arriving in the home before any visual confirmation of its source, was not a feature of the telephone's particular design, but of any technology that transmits a human voice without transmitting the body behind it. The sound engineer adjusting a telephone receiver's distance from a microphone in a broadcast booth in 1949 was trying to find an acoustic quality that most people could not have articulated, but immediately recognized, the quality of a voice that seems to come from inside the room, too close to the microphone, and the voice became warm, present, local in a way that felt safe. Too far, and it became distant, thin, easily dismissible. There was a middle distance, a particular ratio of direct sound to room reflection, a subtle compression that telephone lines imposed on voice quality that the engineer was searching for, moving the receiver by fractions of an inch, listening through his own headphones for the point at which the recorded voice stopped sounding like something overheard and started sounding like something addressed. When he found it, the voice in the drama would seem to come from no specific location at all, not from the speaker on the other end of a wire, not from the radio set in the corner of the listener's living room, but from somewhere closer than either, from somewhere that had already arrived. The difference between those two acoustic qualities was small, a matter of inches and of the room's particular reverb, but it was, in the architecture of what made a threatening call frightening, exactly everything. A police dispatcher in Columbia, Missouri, reached for her notepad in the early hours of March 19th, 1950, and wrote down an address in pencil. The call had come in from a residential neighborhood on the east side of the city. Before the caller had finished speaking, her hand was already moving toward the radio. The address was the home of the Romack family. 13-year-old Jeanette Christman had been babysitting there that evening while the Romacks attended a party across town, and at some point during the night, she had reached the telephone on the kitchen wall and called for help. By the time officers arrived, she had been killed. The telephone she had used to call the police was listed as evidence, item number 1 in the case report. The handwriting in blue ink, the address typed at the top of the page, and the clean block letters of a department that had not yet learned to expect this kind of entry in its files. The Christman case was never solved. No one was ever charged. The file remained open, its pages accumulating the particular stillness of an investigation that ran out of leads without running out of questions. What the case left behind was not a resolution, but a shape. A young woman alone in a house, a telephone, a call for help that came too late. Folklorist Jan Harold Brunvand, writing decades afterward about the origins and spread of the Babysitter legend, identified the Christman case as one of the real-world events that may have seeded the story's emotional logic in the region where the legend first began to circulate. Columbia, Missouri. The same city, the same particular arrangement of a teenage girl, an empty house, and a telephone that could not, in the end, do enough. It is worth being precise about what that connection means and what it does not mean. A story and an event are not the same thing, and the legend did not grow out of the Christman case in any direct or documented line of transmission. What appears to have happened is something more diffuse, and in some ways more interesting. A real event and a developing story occupied the same geography and the same emotional territory, and each seems to have made the other more legible to the people who encountered them. A community that carried the memory of what had happened to Jeanette Christman had reason to find a story about a girl alone in a house, a telephone, and a threat taking shape in the dark, both plausible and worth passing on. The story, in turn, gave a form to a fear that the real event had left unresolved and unnamed. The Columbia Police Department's records from 1950 occupy a physical space somewhere, a box in an archive, a folder in a filing cabinet, pages that have spent more of their existence undisturbed than examined. The case number is real, the address is real, the telephone, listed under evidence, is real, in the specific way that objects become real when they appear in official documents meant to account for what occurred. Most people who have heard the babysitter legend in any of its forms have never heard of Jeanette Christman. Most people who heard the legend in the early 1960s in Missouri or Illinois, or the surrounding states where it first began to travel, had probably not heard of her either. But the fear that her death made concrete, the specific vulnerability of a young person alone in someone else's house at night, was already present in the air of those neighborhoods when the story began to pass between one teenage voice and another. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's uniform crime reports tracked patterns in home invasion crimes across the post-war decades, and those reports, read in aggregate, described something that residents of American suburbs had begun to feel in a less structured way through the 1950s and into the 1960s. Evening hours carried elevated risk. The specific window between roughly 7 in the evening and midnight, when adult residents were most likely to be away from home and a younger or less experienced caretaker was most likely to be present, appeared consistently in the data as the period of highest exposure. The large multi-room homes that had spread across American suburbs through the post-war building boom were architecturally generous and socially isolating in almost equal measure. A house with 4 bedrooms, a full basement, and a 2-car garage placed considerable distance between its rooms. The sounds of one floor did not always travel clearly to another. An interior that felt comfortable and familiar to a family that had lived in it for years felt considerably less legible to a teenager spending her first Friday evening there, learning the particular way the floorboards settled and trying to decide each time she heard a noise she did not expect, whether it was the house or something else. National Crime Information Center data from the same decades reinforced the pattern. Caretakers, anyone in a home in the temporary absence of the primary adult resident, whether a paid babysitter, a family member staying over, or a neighbor watching the house, were statistically less likely than the primary resident to know the property's layout in full. They were less likely to know which neighbors were reliably home on a given evening, which lights tended to be left on, which doors sometimes failed to latch, which windows the family had been meaning to fix. They were, in short, less anchored to the specific place they were occupying than the people who ordinarily lived there. That unfamiliarity was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It was a quiet gap in knowledge that only became visible under the specific conditions that would make it matter. Bureau of Justice statistics analyses from the 1990s put a number on part of the picture. Approximately 8% of violent home invasion crimes during the period studied involved a caretaker as the primary or intended victim. The figure is not large. Read on its own, it is the kind of statistic that seems to argue against worry rather than for it. But 8% of a national crime dataset represents a very large absolute number of incidents, and what the figure captured was not the full extent of a caretaker's vulnerability, so much as one particular dimension of it, the dimension where harm was realized, documented, and counted. What it could not fully account for was the much larger number of evenings spent in unfamiliar houses by young people who were not harmed but were alone with their own uncertainty about what each sound meant and how much of their unease was reasonable. The story that was circulating in those same decades among teenage girls at slumber parties and across school lunch tables was not drawn from the FBI's annual reports. The girls who passed the legend from one voice to the next had not read the caretaker statistics or reviewed the evening crime data. What they had done was grow up in the same suburbs that generated those statistics, spend evenings in houses not their own, and feel the particular quality of quiet that settles over a house when the people who know it best are somewhere else. The legend was not an analysis of the risk. It was a way of holding the risk, of giving it a shape that could be examined and put back down, passed along and received, and passed along again. Richard Speck was 24 years old in July of 1966 when he broke into a townhouse on the south side of Chicago, where 9 student nurses from South Chicago Community Hospital were living. 8 of them were home that night. Between the late evening of July 13th and the early morning of July 14th, he murdered all 8. Corazon Moreau, the 9th woman in the house, survived by sliding under a bed and remaining there through the night, hidden behind a curtain that brushed the floor, listening. She would later testify that she lay still until dawn, when the sounds from the rest of the house had finally stopped. When Moreau emerged into the silence at around 5 in the morning and made her way to a window on the 2nd floor, where she called out to the street below until a neighbor heard her and called the police. Her testimony was the primary evidence against Speck at trial, and she delivered it in a Chicago courtroom where every seat was filled with reporters who had been covering the case since the morning the bodies were found. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Speck was convicted on all 8 counts of murder and sentenced to death, though that sentence was later commuted after the Supreme Court's 1972 ruling in Furman v. Georgia temporarily suspended capital punishment. He died in prison in 1991 of a heart attack 1 day before his 50th birthday. Cultural historians who have written about the Speck case and its aftermath have noted the particular effect it had on the American sense of the home as a place of safety. The 8 nurses were not targeted because of who they were individually. They were targeted because of where they were, in a house, at night, in a neighborhood that Speck had moved through without drawing attention. The townhouse they shared was not isolated in any dramatic geographic sense. It sat on a residential street, surrounded by other buildings, within reach of neighbors who were home. What the case revealed was that proximity to other people was not by itself a guarantee of anything. A house could be simultaneously visible and inaccessible. The distance between the nurse's window and the neighbor who finally heard Amaral call out was not a great physical distance, but it had been, through all the hours of the night, an absolute one. The sense that the home's boundaries were not as reliable as they appeared was not new in 1966, but the Speck case gave it an unusually specific and widely publicized form. The newspapers covered it extensively. Television news reported it. The details of what had happened, the number of women and single survivor, the fact that she had hidden and remained still while listening to what was happening in the rooms around her, circulated through American households in the weeks and months after July 14th in the specific way that traumatic public events circulate, absorbed and processed and set aside and remembered again in a different context. The Babysitter legend, in the version that was already circulating by 1966, did not describe what had happened in the nurse's townhouse. The two stories share a structure: isolation, a house, the presence of a threat within what should have been a safe interior. But the legend was not derived from the Speck case and did not incorporate its specific details. What seems to have happened instead is that the Speck case deepened the cultural soil in which the legend was growing, making its central premise that a house could contain, without your knowledge, someone who meant you harm, feel less like the premise of a scary story and more like a proposition that recent events had given reason to take seriously. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, reviewing cases of home intrusion and stalking across the decades that followed, documented a pattern in offender behavior that had appeared consistently enough to be treated as a behavioral signature rather than an accident of individual psychology. Offenders who planned their crimes with any degree of deliberateness tended to surveil their targets before acting. The surveillance was rarely dramatic. It did not typically involve obvious watching or presence that a victim or neighbor would be likely to notice. What it more often involved was observation of patterns: when lights came on and went off, when cars arrived and departed, when a given house was occupied by its primary residents, and when it was not. The data on this pattern was assembled from case files, from offender interviews conducted after conviction, and from behavioral analysis of crime scenes, and it described something that the babysitter legend had been dramatizing for years through the specific device of the phone calls. And the threatening caller in the legend is at his most distilled a figure who knows where the babysitter is, and she does not know where he is. The calls establish his awareness of her without giving her any reciprocal information about him. He can locate her, monitor her, and assess her state while remaining, from her perspective, entirely sourceless. The phone operator's eventual disclosure that the calls are coming from inside the house is not the introduction of the threat. It is the revelation that the threat has been present through all the preceding calls, undetected, already inside the perimeter she had reason to believe was secure. What made the legend scenario emotionally resonant, and what the FBI's behavioral research confirmed in a different register, was the specific danger of that informational asymmetry, the possibility that someone with bad intentions already knew more about a situation than the person who was living in it. Dennis Rader spent 17 years in the Wichita, Kansas area before his arrest in 2005, and in that time he murdered 10 people. He identified himself in communications sent to police and news organizations as BTK, an acronym for his stated method. He was a church president, a compliance officer for his local government, a married man with children, a resident of his neighborhood for decades. His crimes were separated by gaps of years, sometimes of almost a decade, and investigators who worked the cases during those gaps had no reliable way of knowing whether the killer had stopped, had left the area, or was simply quiet. Rader's own accounts, given in interviews and in courtroom statements after his arrest, described a process of selecting and observing targets that preceded each murder by weeks or months. He drove through neighborhoods, he watched houses, he identified periods when a particular home's occupant was likely to be alone, when there would be no one else present, when an approach would not be observed or interrupted. The process he described was methodical and patient, and it was invisible to the people he was watching. The ordinary appearance of a residential street, a house with a porch light on, a car in the driveway, the neighborhood quiet at that hour, contained in several instances across those 17 years an observer that none of the residents could see. A street in Wichita in 1977 looks in the photographs that exist from that period like a street, low houses set back from the sidewalk, trees planted when the neighborhood was new, old enough now to have grown past the roof lines, a car parked at the curb, the light failing in the late afternoon, the windows of the houses beginning to glow as the interior lights come on. There is nothing visible in those photographs or in the descriptions of those streets that separates them from any other residential neighborhood in any other Midwestern city in the middle of the 1970s. That was the point, though not in any way that the people who lived on those streets could have named or used. The ordinaries of the street was not proof of its safety. It was simply its appearance on the days when photographs were taken, or on the evenings when neighbors moved between their houses without noticing anything. Rader's behavioral pattern, the patient observation, the identified period of reduced occupancy, the gap between the decision to act and the act itself, is not unique to him in the annals of violent crime, though the scale and duration of his activity and the relative clarity of his own testimony about it have made his case unusually well documented. The FBI's broader behavioral analyses found that the pattern appeared with regularity across a wide range of serious offenders, varied in detail, but consistent in its basic shape: threat preceded by observation, action preceded by information gathering, harm preceded by a period in which the offender knew considerably more about the situation than the victim did. The babysitter legend does not begin with the calls coming from inside the house. It begins earlier with the first call, which is simply a call, possibly a wrong number, possibly an odd question. The caller establishes contact. He calls again. The calls continue. Each one individually might be explained away or dismissed. Together they form a pattern that the babysitter in the story registers as wrong before she can articulate exactly why. The escalation is gradual and the threat is ambient, present in the accumulation of calls rather than in any single moment of unambiguous danger. That structure mirrors what behavioral analysis has found about the early stages of targeted threat in real cases, the period in which observation and contact precede any overt action, during which the person being observed is often aware that something is wrong without being certain enough to act on that awareness. The Bureau of Justice Statistics table that a researcher would have found in a 1990s report on residential crime sat in a stack of printed pages, the way that such documents do, dense with data, organized in rows and columns that each represent a category of incident, a type of location, a class of victim. One row, distinguished by the word caretaker, carried a number slightly larger than the rows above and below it. The highlighted yellow of a researcher's marker drew attention to it in the copy that was passed between colleagues or folded into a briefing for law enforcement training, but the number itself did not change depending on whether anyone was looking at it. It had always been there, built into the data set from the cases filed, the incidents reported, the investigations that had turned into records. The researcher whose office held that table could have looked out the window and seen an ordinary suburban street in afternoon light, the kind of street where babysitters had been sitting for 30 years, where teenagers had spent Friday evenings in houses not their own, where families had gone out for the evening, trusting that the person they left behind was safe. The street would have looked quiet. Most evenings it was. The table did not contradict the quietness of the street so much as it sat alongside it, holding the information that the street could not hold for itself. The aggregate of all the evenings across all the neighborhoods where the quiet had not held, where the pattern of elevated risk in the evening window had been realized rather than simply present, where the caretaker sitting in someone else's house had found out that being in a house and being safe in a house were not always the same thing. There is a quality to these facts when they are gathered together in one place that is different from the quality of any of them individually. The Columbia, Missouri police report from 1950 is a single document. Corazon Amara's testimony is the account of one survivor in one case. The FBI pattern data is a generalization across thousands of incidents, and Dennis Rader's behavioral history is the record of one man whose particular pathology was unusually prolonged and unusually documented. None of these things was designed to speak to the others. They came from different sources, different time periods, different kinds of investigation and record keeping. What connects them is a shared structural truth about the relationship between isolation, familiarity, and risk in residential spaces during evening hours, a truth that the babysitter legend had been articulating in narrative form since approximately 1960, before most of the documentation existed to confirm it. Folklore, as an academic discipline, is careful about the relationship between a legend and the real-world conditions it describes. Scholars who have studied the babysitter story have been clear that the legend is not a report. It is not journalism. It does not describe specific events in verifiable locations on particular dates. What it does is something different. It distills a cluster of fears that were grounded in real conditions, gives them a repeatable form, and passes that form from one person to another in a way that allows the community to think about the fears without having to directly confront the specific events that gave rise to them. The story about a babysitter and a threatening caller is manageable in a way that the Chrisman case file is not. It can be told and retold, varied and localized, passed around a circle of teenagers at a slumber party, set down when it becomes too vivid, picked up again later. The real events that informed its emotional architecture could not be picked up and set down with the same ease. What the real events contributed to the legend was not content so much as credibility. A story that described a genuinely impossible scenario would circulate differently than one that described a possible one. The babysitter legend circulated with the particular tenacity that it did because the people who heard it recognized its shape, not because they had read the crime statistics or the behavioral analyses, but because they had grown up in suburbs, sat in houses not their own, heard sounds they could not immediately identify, and felt the specific unease of being responsible for a space whose full dimensions they did not know. The legend gave that feeling a name. It gave it a narrative form, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It offered a version of the scenario in which the threat was recognized in time, in which the phone operator traced the call, in which the babysitter got out, and it offered that version to the people who were most likely to find themselves in the scenario's opening conditions, as though the story were a small piece of preparation that cost nothing to carry. The Columbia, Missouri police report from March 19, 1950, is not the legend. It is a document from a real investigation into a real crime that was never solved, filed in a city archive and mostly undisturbed in the years since. The legend is not the report. But both of them describe a teenage girl, a house, a telephone, and the particular kind of danger that arrives at a door you had no reason to expect it to come through. The report describes what happened once, in one place, on one night. The legend describes what that once might have meant, what shape the fear it left behind was, and how far it could travel when it was given a voice and passed along. The Bureau of Justice statistics table sits in a researcher's office in afternoon light, the window behind the desk looking out onto an ordinary street. The highlighted row holds its number quietly among the rows above and below it, each one a category, a type, a percentage. Outside the window, the street continues, houses with the lights on inside, a car turning the corner at moderate speed. The particular mid-afternoon quiet of a residential neighborhood in the hours before the evening window opens, and the statistical pattern shifts in one direction, and then for most people, most evenings, shifts back without incident. The table does not resolve anything, it is a count. It reflects what happened across a period of years in a country full of houses, and the people who lived in them, and the people who occasionally found themselves alone in those houses on behalf of someone else. What the count captures is the aggregate of individual evenings, the ones that went quietly until morning, and the smaller number that did not. The researcher who highlighted the caretaker row did so because the number was notable, not because it was the largest on the page. It was notable because the figure attached to that specific word confirmed, in the quantitative language of a federal statistics bureau, something that a story had been saying for 30 years in the imprecise but somehow more durable language of a legend told in the dark. The street outside the researcher's window is fully lit. The afternoon is ordinary. The file is on the desk with its highlighted row visible on the open page, the rest of the document fanned slightly underneath it, the whole stack sitting beside a coffee cup and a notepad, and the comfortable disorder of a workspace that gets used every day. The question the highlighted row poses is not answered by the table. It is held by it, registered, measured to a percentage point, placed in a row with a label. Outside the window, an ordinary suburban afternoon continues at its ordinary pace, the light beginning its slow shift toward the earlier dark of late autumn. The houses along the street standing exactly where they have always stood, familiar and full of rooms and lit from within, a kitchen at night. Every object is exactly where it was left, the dish towel folded over the oven handle, the glass on the counter beside the sink, the chair pushed in at exactly the angle it always sits. Everything is correct. And yet the cabinet above the refrigerator is open, and the person standing in the doorway in bare feet cannot remember opening it. That specific experience, the familiar room suddenly requiring re-examination, the brain running its safety map against the present moment, and finding a small, insistent discrepancy, has been studied with some care by researchers working in what is called environmental psychology. What they found is this: familiar spaces are not easier to process when something is wrong inside them. They are harder. The mind has to do two things at once. It must register the threat, and it must simultaneously revise a map it has been building for months or years, a map it trusted completely until a moment ago. The cabinet was always closed. The cabinet is now open. These two facts cannot both be true, and the brain must decide, in the space of a few seconds, which version of the room it is now standing in. Researchers gave a name to this experience. They called it contextual violation, using the term to describe the particular quality of alarm that arises not simply from danger, but from danger appearing inside a space that the brain had already fully categorized as safe. The term is clinical and precise, and the thing it describes is something almost everyone has felt at least once: the wrongness of a right place, the way a familiar hallway can feel longer at 2 in the morning than it did at 2 in the afternoon, even though the measurements have not changed at all. What the research established, across a number of studies conducted in both laboratory conditions and real domestic environments, was that contextual violation produces a measurably different stress response than threat encountered in an unfamiliar setting. An unexpected sound in an alley registers as alarming. The same unexpected sound inside a home registers as alarming and disorienting. The disorientation itself adding a layer of cognitive load that makes the alarm harder to process and slower to resolve. The brain spends a fraction of its capacity simply trying to reconcile what it knows with what it is hearing, and that fraction is not available for the clear, direct assessment of what to do next. A single open cabinet in the right kitchen at the right hour is enough to set that process moving. The cabinet is not frightening on its own, neither is the quiet, nor the hour, nor the bare feet on the cold tile, but together, inside a space that the mind has marked as fully known, they arrive with a weight that none of them would carry in a less familiar room. The philosopher Sigmund Freud described something adjacent to this in an essay he published in 1919. Though he was not working with the data of an environmental psychology lab, he was working with a word. The word was German, unheimlich, In its standard usage, it meant something like uncanny or eerie, a feeling of wrongness without a clear source. But Freud noticed something in the structure of the word itself. Heimlich means homely, familiar, belonging to the home. The prefix *un* reverses it. What the word literally encodes, in its own etymology, is the feeling produced when the home itself becomes unfamiliar, when the place that was supposed to be the safest possible location turns into the location from which the strangeness is coming. Freud's essay ranged across literature, fairy tales, and his own clinical case histories, but it kept returning to the same underlying structure, that the most unsettling form of strangeness was not strangeness encountered in a remote or unknown place, but strangeness that arose from within the familiar. The foreign country can be alien and disorienting and remain simply foreign. It is the childhood home, revisited and somehow changed, that produces the deeper and stranger unease. The mechanisms Freud was describing were not the same as the ones environmental psychologists would later measure, but they pointed toward the same phenomenon from a different angle, the particular weight of the wrong thing in the right place. That weight had an architecture. It was not random, and the fact that the architecture was consistent enough for Freud to have written about it in 1990, and for researchers to have measured it in controlled settings decades later, suggested that it was not a product of any particular culture or historical moment, but of something more basic about the way a mind organizes space and safety, and what it does when those two things come apart. The psychologist Stanley Schachter published a study in the 1950s that took a different approach to the same territory. Schachter was interested in what people do when they are afraid, and in particular, he was interested in the role that other people play in that process. His method was straightforward. He brought research participants into a room, told them that the experiment they were about to take part in would involve a mild electric shock, and then gave them a choice: wait alone in a comfortable private room, or wait in a room with other participants who were in the same situation. The result was consistent and clear. The large majority of participants chose to wait with others. The anticipation of a threat, even a modest and laboratory-controlled one, produced an immediate and strong desire for company. Schachter called this the affiliation effect. The name is dry and precise, and it sits somewhat at a distance from the thing it describes, which is the specific and urgent feeling of not wanting to be alone when something might be wrong. He went on to demonstrate that this preference for company was not simply about distraction or comfort, though those things were present. It was also functional. People in groups assessed threat more accurately than people alone. They compared observations, questioned each other's interpretations, and arrived at more calibrated responses than isolated individuals working through the same information by themselves. Isolation, Schachter found, did not sharpen a person's attention, it narrowed it. The follow-on research was equally consistent. When participants were placed in threatening situations and kept isolated, prevented from speaking to anyone else, unable to observe others' reactions, their fear assessments became less reliable in both directions. Some participants became more afraid than the situation warranted. Some became less afraid in a pattern that looked less like calm and more like the brain shutting down the assessment process because it could not complete it without more information than it had. The social environment, it turned out, was part of the threat assessment system. Remove it, and the system did not simply continue functioning with one component missing. It worked differently in ways that consistently made accurate assessment harder. The specific situation the babysitter legend describes: a young person alone in a large house, responsible for children asleep upstairs, with no adult present, and neighbors who are strangers, is a near-perfect map of the conditions shocked her, identified as cognitively most costly. There is no one to check an observation against. There is no one whose calm can calibrate one's own, and no one whose alarm can confirm what seems alarming. The house is familiar enough to carry the particular weight of contextual violation if anything inside it changes, and unfamiliar enough someone else's home with its own floor plan and acoustics to add to that weight rather than reduce it. What a person alone in that situation has is the telephone, and the telephone in that architecture does something very specific. It offers the possibility of connection without resolving the isolation. It can carry a voice across the distance between houses without changing the fact that there is distance between them, and the person who picks it up is still alone in the room with whatever made them reach for it. Research published in the journal Psychophysiology examined the physiological experience of threat in enclosed indoor environments in some detail. The fight or flight response, the body's automatic alarm system, the rapid surge of hormones that prepares a person to run or to defend themselves, evolved in open environments where physical action was possible and often sufficient. An animal that hears a threat in an open landscape can run. The act of running discharges the stress hormones that prepared it to run. The response is initiated. It produces its action. The action resolves the threat or removes the animal from it, and the body returns to baseline. The whole cycle has a shape: up, across, and down. In an enclosed indoor environment, that shape changes. The hormones are released, the body is prepared for action, but the spatial options are limited. A person standing in a kitchen in a house at night cannot run in a useful direction. They can move through the house, but moving through the house requires moving closer to some rooms and farther from others without the possibility of simply removing themselves from the space entirely. The fight or flight response, designed for a world in which the response could produce its action and conclude, instead produces a sustained state of arousal that has nowhere to go. The body stays ready, the hormones circulate. The readiness does not discharge because there is nothing concrete enough to discharge it against, and the elevated state continues, sometimes for much longer than the initial alarm might suggest is warranted. What the researchers found in their measurements was not that enclosed environments made people more afraid. It was that the fear, once initiated, lasted differently in an enclosed space. The same stimulus that produced 20 minutes of elevated arousal in an open environment produced closer to 40 minutes in an enclosed one, with the additional time accounted for entirely by the absence of an action that could resolve the response. The body remained prepared for something it was not given the opportunity to do, and the preparation itself became the sustained condition. This has a practical implication that is strange to sit with. It means that the specific environment of a house at night, the rooms, the closed doors, The hallway between the stairs and the kitchen is not simply a setting in which fear happens, it is a feature of the fear itself. The walls and the closed doors, and the fact that the layout can be known without being visible all at once, contribute to the duration and quality of the fearful state in ways that a field or a street or any open space would not. The house holds the fear inside it, the way it holds the warm air, not aggressively, not with any intent, but simply because that is what enclosed spaces do. A person standing in a house at 2 in the morning, every familiar object exactly where it always is, the coat rack beside the front door, the framed photograph on the hallway wall, the light switch at exactly the height a hand knows without looking, is already in an environment that the research suggests will extend any alarm and make it harder to discharge. The ordinariness of every visible object does not reduce the extension. It sometimes adds to it in the manner of contextual violation, because each correct thing makes an incorrect sound more incorrect by contrast. The coat rack is where it always is, the photograph is where it always is, and somewhere above the ceiling, or behind the door at the end of the hall, something made a sound that does not belong to the list of sounds this house makes. The mind begins a search. It is a specific kind of search, not the exploratory, curious attention of the daytime, but the tight, scanning attention of a system under alert. It moves through the list of possible explanations. It assigns probabilities. It looks for the evidence that would allow it to close the question and return to the previous state. What the research suggests is that in an enclosed space, in isolation, with the fight or flight response already circulating and nowhere to discharge, the search takes longer and returns less certainty than the same search would produce in better conditions. The architectural cross-section of a house, the kind that appears in a builder's diagram, with each room labeled and the walls drawn thin to show the floor plan, makes this visible in a way that is almost geometrical. From any single standing position in a standard 2-story house, the number of rooms that are fully and directly visible is very small. A person standing in the kitchen can see the kitchen. They can see a portion of the hallway, and through the hallway perhaps the foot of the stairs. They cannot see the living room unless the door is open. They cannot see the upstairs landing. They cannot see any of the bedrooms, or the basement if there is one, or the area behind the staircase, or the far side of any room with furniture in it. The house is known to the person who lives in it or cares for it, but known and visible are not the same thing. The dotted lines that architects draw to indicate sight lines, the direct, unobstructed angles from one point to another, are, in a standard house plan, far shorter than the floor plan itself. They stop at walls, they stop at corners, they stop at the edge of a door frame, or the far side of a bookcase, or the curve of a hallway. The house contains many more spaces that cannot be seen from any given position than spaces that can, and this is not a design failure. It is simply what houses are, private spaces built around the assumption that they are already safe, so they do not need to be surveyed. That assumption is correct almost all of the time. The sightline diagram does not represent a threat, it represents geometry. But when the fight or flight response is activated and the mind is scanning and the cortisol is circulating with nowhere to discharge, the sight lines that stop at walls become the shape of what is unknown, and the unknown is where the scanning attention keeps returning, not to the kitchen, which can be seen, not to the portion of the hallway that is visible, to the corner of the hallway that cannot be seen, and the top of the stairs, and the far room, and the space under the landing that the single light does not quite reach. Research into the physiological effects of telephone harassment documented this spatial quality in a way that sits slightly outside the fight or flight literature, but connects to it clearly enough. Studies published in Violence and Victims, and in Psychiatric Services, examined people who had received sustained anonymous threatening calls that were identified and eventually stopped, but that had continued for varying periods before stopping. The researchers found, consistently, that recipients developed symptoms that persisted well after the calls ended. Some of these symptoms were what clinical literature would categorize as anxiety responses. Some were more specific to the experience of the telephone itself, a particular difficulty with the sound of a phone ringing, a reluctance to answer calls, a hypervigilance around the telephone as an object that took months or years to resolve. What the researchers highlighted as particularly notable was the mechanism behind these persistent symptoms. The calls had been alarming in part because of what they said or implied, but they had been alarming in a specific way that ordinary alarming events were not. The caller was invisible, the caller's location was unknown, and the information between the two parties was entirely asymmetric. The caller knew where the recipient was. The caller could hear the recipient's voice, assess their state, and make decisions based on what they learned. The recipient knew none of these things. They did not know who was calling, or from where, or what information the caller already had. Every call began with the recipient at a structural disadvantage that no amount of calm or clarity could equalize, because the disadvantage was in the situation itself rather than in how anyone responded to it. This asymmetry is not unique to threatening calls. It is present in any anonymous communication in which the receiver cannot know who is initiating contact or why. But the telephone made it acutely physical in a way that, say, an anonymous letter did not. An anonymous letter arrives and is finished arriving. It does not continue. It does not ring again. The telephone rang again, and the ringing itself carried the asymmetry before anyone had picked it up, the not knowing, the complete and structural impossibility of knowing, arriving in the form of a mechanical bell in a quiet room. The clinical researchers found that this asymmetry produced a specific and lasting effect on how recipients processed ordinary domestic environments. Spaces that had previously felt safe felt watched in a way the recipients described consistently as difficult to locate, not the sense of a specific presence, but the sense of a possible one. The home, which had been the background against which life happened without requiring much attention, became an object of ongoing low-level scrutiny. The coat rack, the windows, the sound of the house settling. Each of these things had always been present, and they had been ignored because they did not need attention. After sustained exposure to the asymmetric invisibility of an anonymous threatening caller, they required attention again, the way they might have required it in a new house before the new house became familiar. What the research is describing across these different studies and different methodologies and different specific questions is a set of conditions that fit together with a particular logic. Familiar space produces contextual violation when something inside it is wrong. Isolation removes the social calibration that helps assess threat accurately. Enclosed environments extend the fight-or-flight response without providing the action that would discharge it. And the specific mechanism of the telephone introduces an asymmetry, the possibility of being known without knowing, that adds the quality of being watched to the quality of being alone. None of these conditions requires anything unusual to happen. The open cabinet is enough for the first. The empty house is enough for the second. The walls and the closed doors are enough for the third. and the telephone on the kitchen wall, which can ring from anywhere, from anyone, at any hour, is enough for the fourth. A house at night, with those four conditions present, does not need an intruder to become a particular kind of experience. The architecture provides it. The isolation provides it. The telephone, silent on its hook, provides it simply by existing as the device through which the outside world arrives without warning and without a face. Freud's asterisk, unheimlich, asterisk, and Schachter's affiliation experiments, and the asterisk psychophysiology, asterisk study, and the clinical work on harassment recipients are not four separate findings. They are four different views of the same interior geography, the specific landscape of a familiar space, at night, in isolation, with the possibility of contact from an unknown source. The researchers came to this landscape from different directions. They used different instruments and asked different questions and wrote their findings in different kinds of language. But the landscape they were each describing was recognizably the same one. Environmental psychology added one more piece that is worth sitting with for a moment. Researchers studying how people move through and orient within indoor spaces found that familiarity with a layout produces a form of cognitive economy. The mind stops spending energy on spatial mapping when it already knows where everything is and redirects that energy elsewhere. This is efficient. It is part of what makes a home rather than simply a building, the reduction of the cognitive cost of being in it so that the energy can go toward whatever happens to be happening. When something is wrong inside that familiar space, the efficiency reverses. The mapping has to start again. The mind, which had been spending almost nothing on the question of where things are, suddenly has to spend considerably more because the map it trusted has turned out to contain an error, and any map that contains one error might contain others. The cabinet is open. What else might have changed? The question is not dramatic. It does not arrive as a shout. It arrives as a quiet reallocation of attention, a redirecting of cognitive resources toward the room, the hallway, the sounds, the angles that were previously beneath notice. And this is the experience that the babysitter legend understood, in the way that stories understand things, not through measurement or analysis, but through the selection and arrangement of details that trigger the right response in the listener. The story understood that the house itself was the mechanism. The caller, the operator, the line traced, those are the narrative events. But the house was always the medium through which the experience arrived. The rooms one could not see from where one was standing. The sound that the staircase made when no one was on it. The knowledge that there were sleeping children upstairs and no direct sightline to where they were. The legend chose a babysitter and not a homeowner for a reason that the psychological literature, examined in retrospect, makes clear. A homeowner would know the house differently. They would know which floorboards creaked and what the refrigerator sounded like at night, and where the drafts came from and the particular settling noise the furnace made. They would carry a map built from long familiarity, detailed enough to absorb a great deal of incoming information without triggering contextual violation. The babysitter's map was newer and less complete. They knew where the light switches were, and roughly how the rooms connected, and which door was the bathroom and which was the linen closet. They did not know, not yet, all the ordinary sounds the house made when no one was doing anything. The unfamiliar familiar space is its own category, and it was the category the legend placed its protagonist in, with precision. Not a stranger in a strange house, a stranger in a known house. Someone who had been given the layout and the emergency numbers and the information about where the extra blankets were stored. Someone who knew enough to navigate the space confidently and not quite enough to know when it was behaving strangely. The specific cognitive position from which contextual violation is easiest, and isolation most costly, and the telephone most asymmetric. The research did not produce this insight about the legend. The legend existed before the research that could articulate it. What the research did was provide a set of terms for something the story had already understood, that there was a specific kind of person, in a specific kind of place, at a specific kind of hour, for whom the conditions were arranged in exactly the way most likely to make the wrong thing feel very wrong indeed. Stanley Schachter's empty waiting room, the chairs arranged around the edges, nobody sitting in them, the mild electric shock still 30 minutes away, is a useful image to keep nearby. It is not a frightening room. Nothing has happened in it. The shock has not arrived. The room is well lit, and the chairs are padded, and there is no actual danger present. And still, the large majority of people who sat alone in that room chose, when given the option, to sit somewhere else. They chose the company of strangers who were in the same position over the technically equivalent comfort of a private room with no one in it. What Schachter was measuring was not cowardice or irrationality. He was measuring a real function, the way that the presence of another person resolves the cognitive problem of threat assessment in a way that no amount of solitary reasoning can fully replicate. The other person is data. They are real-time information about whether a reaction is calibrated or excessive, whether the alarm is warranted or a response to something that turns out to be nothing. A person sitting alone in a house has to answer all of those questions without any of that data, using only the information their own nervous system provides, which is the fight-or-flight literature firmly established, not designed for precision under those conditions. The telephone, in the legend's architecture, provides the only possible substitute for that data. The operator, the parent calling to check in, the friend who knows the address, these are voices that arrive through the wire and offer what the empty room does not. The legend understood this too, which is why the horror pivots on the telephone becoming the source of the problem rather than the solution to it. The one instrument that could resolve the isolation is the instrument through which the isolation gets worse. The one voice that arrives through the wire is not the one that calibrates the fear and brings it back to baseline. It is the one that confirms that the fear was correct and then adds something worse to it, the specific asymmetry of a caller who knows more than they should. The architectural cross-section sits quietly in its own diagram, the sight lines drawn in dotted lines that stop at walls. Each room is labeled. The staircase is visible from two positions in the diagram, and from neither of them is the landing visible. The diagram does not convey alarm. It conveys the geometry of a house, the ordinary necessary fact that houses are built of enclosed spaces that connect to each other at corners and through doors, and that no single position within them provides a full view of the whole. It is a builder's document, technically correct, mildly interesting to someone considering a renovation or trying to understand how airflow moves between floors. Spread flat on a desk in a quiet room, with afternoon light coming through the window and the suburban street outside, going about its ordinary afternoon, the cross-section is simply a diagram. The rooms are labeled, the sight lines are drawn, the spaces that cannot be seen from a single standing position are in the diagram as visible as all the others, and the house it represents contains nothing but the geometry that houses have always contained, and no particular reason for any of it to require a second look. A flatbed editing table in a small room in Los Angeles holds a reel of 16mm film, and the sound it makes as it runs is a soft, mechanical purr. the kind of sound that fills a room without demanding anything from it. The year is 1977. The room is not large. There is a lamp on the table, a splicing block, a roll of tape, and a can of coffee that has been cold for some time. Fred Walton is rewinding the reel to a single moment, the frame just before a telephone rings in an empty kitchen. He has watched this moment many times already. The kitchen in the film is ordinary: a counter, a window, the particular stillness of a room with no one in it. The telephone is mounted to the wall. It has not rung yet. He runs the reel forward a few frames, back again, forward. What he is looking for is the exact length of silence before the ring that makes the ring feel inevitable rather than startling, the difference between a sound that jolts and a sound that lands. These are not the same thing. One produces a spike of adrenaline and resolves. The other settles into the chest and stays. The short film he is cutting will be called Asterisk the Sitter, Asterisk. It is approximately 20 minutes long. It will not be seen by many people in this form. In 2 years, with Columbia Pictures funding and an expanded script, it will become Asterisk When a Stranger Calls, Asterisk, and the kitchen and the telephone and the silence before the ring will remain essentially intact. The original sequence carried forward into a larger work, the way a seed carries its information into the plant that grows from it. But on this night, in 1977, none of that has happened yet. There is only the reel, the lamp, and the question of how long silence has to last before something ordinary becomes something else. The answer, it turns out, is not very long at all. Asterisk, When a Stranger Calls, Asterisk opened in theaters in October of 1979. Its first 20 minutes follow a babysitter named Jill Johnson in a large house, alone with 2 sleeping children, receiving a series of anonymous telephone calls. The calls are short at first. They become longer. They stop. They resume. The film withholds what any viewer watching it would instinctively want: a clear look at the space the caller might be occupying, a confirmation or denial of the thing the calls are beginning to imply. For roughly 20 minutes, the film simply refuses to provide that confirmation. The camera stays with the girl at the telephone. The house stays dark behind her. The calls continue. Roger Ebert, reviewing the film, noted that this extended withholding was doing something structurally unusual for horror cinema at the time. Most horror films of the late 1970s were accelerating, building visual evidence, stacking revelation on revelation, moving toward confrontation with increasing speed. Asterisk, When a Stranger Calls, Asterisk moved in the opposite direction. It slowed down. It gave the audience less to hold on to, rather than more. The anxiety it produced was not the anxiety of watching something terrible happen, but the anxiety of not yet knowing whether something terrible was happening, which is, as Ebert implied, and as most people who have sat in the dark waiting for a sound to repeat can confirm, a considerably more durable condition. Bravo's 2004 television special on the 100 most effectively frightening sequences in horror film history placed Jill Johnson's sequence of calls near the top of its list. The producers of that special interviewed filmmakers and critics and horror scholars, and the answers they collected circled a common theme. What made the sequence work was not what it showed, but what it held back. The specific image of a telephone on a wall in a quiet house while children sleep upstairs was enough. The audience supplied the rest. They had been supplied with exactly the information needed to allow their imaginations to complete the picture, and their imaginations, given that material and that much darkness and that much silence, did not disappoint. 3 years before Asterisk, When a Stranger Calls, Asterisk opened in theaters, A Canadian director named Bob Clark had already placed a telephone at the center of a horror film's architecture and had done something with it that the later film would not attempt. Asterisk, Black Christmas, Asterisk was released in 1974. It is set in a sorority house at the end of a semester, and its central threat is a caller whose voice comes from inside the house from the very beginning of the film, not discovered partway through, not revealed as a twist, but present and located in the attic before the audience knows to look for him there. The film's most technically distinctive achievement was its treatment of the caller's voice itself. Bob Clark's sound engineers in a Toronto recording studio in 1974 recorded 3 separate voice tracks, 3 different vocal performances of the threatening calls, and layered them onto a single reel of magnetic tape. The resulting composite voice is not identifiably one person. It shifts register mid-sentence. It contains sounds that are not quite words, and words that are not quite sounds. Listening to it through headphones, as the engineers did on playback, the effect is of something that does not follow the normal acoustic rules of a human voice in a room, something that seems to come from more than one direction, or no particular direction at all. Film historians have credited Asterisk Black Christmas, Asterisk, as the first major theatrical horror film to use the device of a threatening call, traced to a location inside the building itself. The trace in the film is performed by a telephone operator, a technical process that, in 1974, required time and manual routing through switchboard relays, a detail the film uses accurately and deliberately. The trace takes long enough that the knowledge arrives only after the danger has already been established. The information the operator provides is not the beginning of safety. It is only the confirmation of what has been, for the film's entire running time, already true. Clark himself said in later interviews that the film was not primarily about fear as a sensation, but about the specific cognitive discomfort of occupying a space that has been compromised without your knowledge, a house that has been entered, a boundary that has been crossed, a phone line that has been used from inside the room where it hangs on the wall. The horror was not in what the caller might do. It was in the fact that the house the characters believed they understood had already quietly become something different from what they thought it was. This is a distinction that the legend the films were drawing on had always understood. The story of the babysitter and the calls from inside did not originate with Fred Walton or Bob Clark. Both filmmakers were reaching for something that had already been in circulation for at least 15 years before either film was made, a story that had been told at slumber parties, in school hallways, in the back seats of cars on suburban streets at night, told by teenage girls to other teenage girls who told it to others, the way oral traditions have always moved, from one voice to the next, each telling slightly adjusted, each core detail kept. The telephone, the calls, the children upstairs, the trace, the house. What the films did was not invent the story. What they did was find the story a fixed form, a version that could be repeated exactly, projected in theaters, rented on videotape, watched alone in a living room with the television the only light, and a telephone on the kitchen wall, visible through the doorway behind the screen. A teenager watching Asterisk When a Stranger Calls Asterisk on VHS in 1987 would have experienced something particular about that configuration. The film playing in front of them and the telephone in the kitchen behind them occupied the same physical space. The story on the screen was not entirely separate from the room they were sitting in. The wall between the story's world and their own was thinner than it normally is at the movies, thinner than it is when the story takes place on a spaceship, or in a Victorian manor, or in a swamp in Louisiana. A telephone on a kitchen wall is not a special effect. It is a domestic object. Most houses had one. Many houses still do. The story on the screen was set in a room that could plausibly have been the next room over. This is part of what the legend had always done, set itself in the specific ordinary world of the people it was being told to. The phone was a phone they owned. The house was a house like their house. The children upstairs were children they had babysat, or children who had been babysat while their parents were out for the evening. The scenario was built from components that had no fantastical origin. There was no werewolf, no ancient curse, no figure from another world. There was a phone and a house, and the structural question of who else might be in it. The 2006 remake of When a Stranger Calls, directed by Simon West, posed a problem that no version of the story had needed to solve before. By 2006, the telephone had changed considerably. Caller ID was standard on most landlines. Mobile phones were in most teenagers' pockets. A babysitter receiving an anonymous threatening call in 2006 could, in principle, see the originating number on a small screen before she even picked up the receiver, or could step outside with a cell phone and call the police from the front lawn, removing herself from the house entirely rather than standing at the kitchen wall, tethered to a cord. The original legend's mechanics, the isolation, the single fixed line, the technical impossibility of rapid trace, had been built out of a specific technological moment, and that moment was over. The 2006 film addressed this by constructing a series of narrative complications: a new phone system in the house, a cell signal that failed, circumstances that accumulated to close off each modern escape route in sequence. It is not that the complications were implausible. Each one individually was defensible, but taken together, they revealed by their number and their insistence how much the original story had relied on the particular limitations of the telephone network of the early 1960s. The remake needed 5 explanations where the original had needed none, because the original was native to its technology and the remake was not. What this revealed, without the film intending to reveal it, was something about the relationship between fear and infrastructure. The Babysitter legend was not simply a story about a threat. It was a story about a threat made possible by the specific shape of the world the people telling it actually lived in: the split-level house, the single telephone line, the minutes required to trace a call through a network of manual relays, the fact that large suburban houses had acoustic properties that allowed an attic or a basement to exist, functionally, as a separate country from the kitchen. Remove any one of those features, and the story requires revision. Remove several of them, and you have to rebuild the story from the ground up, which is what the 2006 film discovered it was doing, quietly, scene by scene. Fear, it turns out, is not generic. It is specific. It knows what year it is. Researchers affiliated with the Contemporary Legend Society have surveyed recognition of the Babysitter legend across multiple decades and demographic groups, and the numbers they found were notable. Among respondents born before 1980, recognition of the story exceeded 80%. Among younger respondents, recognition remained high, but the pathway had changed. Older respondents, by a large margin, reported first hearing the story through oral transmission: a friend, a sibling, a cousin at a sleepover, a babysitter who told it to the children she was watching. Younger respondents, by an equally large margin, reported first encountering the story through a film, a television program, or, for the most recent cohort, a website or a social media post. The story was the same story. The telephone was still on the wall. The children were still asleep upstairs. The trace still came back with the same address. But the channel through which the story traveled had shifted in a single generation, from the human voice to the screen to the internet, and in each migration, the story had retained what it needed to retain and shed what no longer served it. This is what durable stories do. They are not rigid. They bend toward their medium without breaking. They find the version of themselves that the available channel can carry, and they move through it, and they arrive at the next listener more or less intact. The internet offered the babysitter legend a new form it had not previously had access to: the written first-person account, posted anonymously, in the voice of someone claiming to have experienced the events described. The genre is called creepypasta, a name that circulated on online forums in the mid-2000s, derived from a common internet practice of copying and pasting text between discussion boards. Creepypasta stories adopted the register of personal testimony, stripped of most identifying details, and placed familiar horror scenarios: a house with something wrong in it, a phone call with something wrong in the voice, a child who knows something the adult does not, in a contemporary, everyday setting. The babysitter scenario appeared in numerous creepypasta iterations from the late 2000s onward. The telephone sometimes became a cell phone, or a baby monitor, or an unfamiliar number appearing on a screen. The house was sometimes a rented house, sometimes the poster's own childhood home, recalled from memory, sometimes a hypothetical, framed as a question asked to a forum. Asterisk. Has anyone else experienced this? Asterisk. The specifics varied, the structure did not. The format rewarded exactly the elements the original legend had always run on: the familiar domestic space, the unexpected communication, the delayed realization of where the threat was located, and the comment sections below each posting functioned as a new version of the slumber party floor, a group of people in the dark, passing the story between them. A Reddit thread from 2011 on a board called r/no sleep contained a creepypasta that moved through the babysitter scenario in a contemporary register, with a cell phone and a suburban house, and a baby monitor crackling with a voice that did not belong to the child. The story was competently written. It was not particularly original. Below it, in the comments, someone wrote only asterisk, "I knew this one before I could read." Asterisk. That comment sat in the thread for years. Other people liked it. Some of them replied to it. What they were agreeing with was not a claim about the specific story posted above it. Most of them had probably never heard that particular version before. What they were agreeing with was the sensation the comment described, the sense that the story had preceded conscious memory, that it had arrived before the listener had the vocabulary to hold it, that it had been carried into them by some channel earlier than reading or watching or being told, as though the story had found them before they were old enough to find it. This is a particular quality of the most persistent oral legends, the ones that survive, not because they are well crafted or well distributed, but because they address something that was already present in the people who encounter them. The babysitter legend found its audience in the specific world of the post-war American suburb. The large houses, the split-level architecture, the single telephone, the assumption of safety built into the domestic interior of a house on a quiet street in a subdivision. It addressed a question that the domestic architecture of that world raised almost by design. What happens in all those rooms you cannot see from where you are standing? And it answered the question with the most structurally unnerving answer available. Someone is already there. The story did not need to be invented, because the question it answered was not invented either. The question was structural. It was architectural. It was built into the floor plan. What changed in the decades since the story first circulated among teenage girls in Missouri and Illinois in 1960 was not the question. The question was still there. Houses still had rooms that could not be seen from the kitchen. People still occupied spaces that belonged to other people, responsible for sleeping children in unfamiliar upper floors. The telephone, or something that had inherited the telephone's function, was still the line of communication between the isolated occupant and the world outside. What changed was everything around the question, the technology that shaped the scenario, the medium through which the story traveled, the generation of listeners who received it, the platform that held the comment sections where people recognized themselves in stories they claimed to have known before they could read. In 1977, in the small room in Los Angeles, with the flatbed editing table and the cold coffee and the reel running back and forth across the moment before the ring, Fred Walton was not thinking about folklore surveys or creepypasta comment sections or the long chain of transmission that had carried his story to him. He was thinking about silence. He was thinking about the specific duration of silence that makes an ordinary sound feel like something it is about to explain. He was thinking about a telephone on a kitchen wall and what the camera needed to do, and how still the room needed to be, and how much time needed to pass in that stillness before the ring would do what he needed it to do. He found what he was looking for. He marked the splice. He ran the reel forward. The film, the short film, not yet the feature, not yet the opening sequence that would be cited in lists and discussed in reviews and watched in living rooms on tape, just the short film on the small screen of the editing table in the quiet room played through the sequence, the kitchen, the stillness, the telephone, and then the ring, arriving in exactly the right amount of silence. What Walton had found in the measuring of that silence was something the story already knew. The legend had always understood that the telephone's ring is not frightening in itself. It is a piece of domestic infrastructure, a signal of ordinary life, a thing that rings dozens of times a day without producing any reaction beyond the mild interest of wondering who is calling. What makes it frightening, in the specific context the babysitter legend constructs, is everything that has already been arranged around it before it rings: the empty house, the late hour, the children upstairs, the caller who has already called once or twice, the suggestion that the calls are not random, that they are not wrong numbers, that they are not coincidental. The ring is frightening because of what it has been made to mean. And what it has been made to mean was constructed long before the film, constructed in the oral tradition, in the slumber party tellings, in the hand-typed folklore collection documents with their underlined phrases, in the structural logic of a two-story house on a suburban street at night.
The film did not create the meaning. The film found the meaning and gave it a fixed form and sent it forward. Bob Clark found it too, working backward through the same material from a different angle, not the girl at the telephone, but the voice at the other end, layered from 3 separate tracks until it no longer sounded entirely human, until it sounded like something that had been inside the house for long enough to lose the quality of being an intruder and a choir. Instead, the quality of a presence that the house itself had somehow produced.
The 3-track composite voice in * Black Christmas * is not frightening because of what it says. It is frightening because of what it sounds like, something that does not have a single origin point, something that cannot be fully located, something whose edges do not match the acoustic edges of the room it is calling from. And that quality, the thing that cannot be fully located, the presence whose edges do not match the space it occupies, is the quality that the babysitter legend had always been carrying at its center. From the first tellings in Missouri in 1960, to the film adaptations, to the VHS rentals, to the forum posts and comment threads of the internet era, what the story was always about was the question of where things are. The children are upstairs, and they are where they are supposed to be. The babysitter is in the kitchen, and she is where she is supposed to be. The caller is where? Outside? Somewhere on the other end of the telephone network? Some anonymous distance away? Or inside? In the basement? In the attic? In one of the rooms that cannot be seen from the kitchen? Present in the house that was supposed to be empty of everyone except the girl and the sleeping children? The moment the trace comes back, the moment the telephone operator's voice delivers the information that changes the status of every room in the house, is the moment the story completes the geometry it has been building. Before that moment, the house has two versions, the one the babysitter believes she is in, and the one that is actually true. After that moment, the two versions collapse into one. The house was always the house with someone else in it. The trace does not create the danger, it only reveals it. This is why the story persists, not because it is frightening in a generic way. There are many frightening stories, and most of them do not survive across 6 decades and 3 or 4 major technological transitions. It persists because the geometry it describes is not fictional. It is the geometry of any enclosed space that is larger than one person's field of vision. It is the geometry of any house with a second floor, or a basement, or a hallway that turns out of sight. The story found the question that domestic architecture raises simply by being what it is, a set of connected rooms, most of which are empty most of the time. In a world where the assumption that emptiness means safety is not always verified, and it answered it with a voice on a telephone line, and it sent the answer from one voice to the next, and the answer kept traveling. In the quiet room in Los Angeles in 1977, the reel ran to the end of its footage, and the flatbed editor's motor slowed, and the room went back to the sound of the cold lamp and the distant street outside. Walton marked the timing on a piece of paper. The splice was made. The reel was rewound. Outside, on the ordinary street, the houses sat in the dark in the ordinary way that houses on ordinary streets sit at night, some of them with porch lights on, some without, some with the blue light of a television visible in an upstairs window, some with all their windows dark. Each of them was a set of connected rooms. Each of them had hallways and stairwells and interior spaces that could not be seen from a single standing position. Each of them was, from the outside, a closed form, walls, a roof, a front door with a lock in it, and from the inside a collection of partials, of partial views and partial information of the strong and reasonable assumption that the rooms not currently occupied were empty. That assumption was, in almost every case, correct. Houses are usually what they appear to be. Rooms are usually empty when they seem to be empty. The telephone, when it rings at night, is usually someone ordinary with an ordinary reason to call. But the story knew. The story had always known, from the first telling to the most recent comment on the most recent forum thread, that asterisk usually, asterisk is not asterisk, always asterisk, and that the distance between those two words is not large enough to be comfortable, and that the specific geometry of a house at night, with its rooms out of sight and its telephone on the wall, is exactly the right shape to hold that small, uncomfortable distance and let a person feel it without being able to put it down. The cursor blinks after the last letter of a comment posted late at night on a forum that is already going quiet. The laptop screen is bright in a dark room. Somewhere in the house, a room away, or 2 rooms away, or at the end of a hallway that cannot be seen from where the laptop sits. Other rooms are doing what rooms do at night, holding still, holding their corners in shadow, holding the ordinary silence of a house that is almost certainly empty except for the person at the screen. The comment reads, asterisk. I knew this one before I could read. Asterisk. The cursor blinks. The screen stays lit. Somewhere in the distance, or in the story, or in the part of the mind that keeps an ear on the rooms it cannot see, a telephone is about to ring, or has just stopped ringing, or is simply there on the wall where it has always been, waiting in the particular quiet way that ordinary things wait, in the rooms of houses on ordinary streets, through the long and uneventful hours of the night. The story is still moving. It is moving the way it has always moved, from one person to the next, finding the ones who already carry the question it was built to answer, settling into them quietly, the way a well-worn story settles, the way any old and widely traveled thing settles when it finally finds somewhere to rest. The screen glows. The room is still.